but welcome everyone. My name is Heather Meadows Adamson. I am a premium tutor here at Appleroot. I've been with Appleroot for about 5.5 years now, and I will say one of my favorite things to do is to give these presentations because what I really like to do is help demystify this whole process for you guys, kind of help guide you through this and figure out what your next steps are in this whole process. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the SAT versus the ACT, the differences, how to pick one, and then also kind of how they fit in the larger, world of college admissions. I'll talk a little bit about kind of some recent changes too. Start though, we'll talk about Appleroot really briefly. So Appleroot is obviously a tutoring company, and we do everything from test prep, like we're going to talk about tonight, to just regular academic prep, executive functioning, and our ideas, our main why is essentially that we are working with the whole student, right? Not just changing their content, but changing their self-beliefs, their confidence. And so again, building skills for school and beyond. We do academic tutoring, test prep, executive function, so lots of stuff from there. And tonight what we're going to do is, again, we're going to compare those two tests, talk a little bit about how to prepare for testing, and then some updates, and then I'll have some questions at the end as well, or I'll time for questions. I will say, if you don't mind keeping your questions until the end, I'm very likely to answer some of your technical questions as we go throughout the presentation tonight. But at the end, I will leave plenty of time for questions. So let's go ahead and dive on in. So the SAT versus the ACT. Structurally, the two tests are pretty similar. They're both going to have a reading section where you read a passage and answer questions about it. They're both going to have a writing English where you read a passage and you're correcting the grammar in it. It's also going to have math. SAT has a math without a calculator, and then a math with a calculator. ACT, that's just one math section. And then a little bit differently is the ACT is going to have a science section, which is different. The SAT doesn't have that. And then there's no essay on the SAT, and the essay on the ACT is optional. So you would kind of know if you had to take the ACT essay. I wouldn't concern yourselves too much with that. But thankfully, overall, about 75 to 80% of the test content does overlap between the two. That's stuff like reading skills, grammar skills, reading graphs, interpreting them, looking at data, doing your basic algebra, some statistics, a little bit of geometry, all of that core stuff that you've kind of been working on the whole time you're in school. The SAT, on the other hand, is going to have more advanced reading. By that, I mean the reading passages you're going to see are going to be more complex sometimes. They're going to ask more complicated questions. You do get more time per question, though. And then there's even more reading in the math section. You're going to have more word problems in the math section. The ACT, on the other hand, has more advanced science. By that, I mean there is a science section. You're going to have to deal with some more science than you will on the SAT. And more advanced math. And again, it doesn't mean the math is always harder. It's just from a wider scope of things. So for example, on the ACT, you may get questions about the unit circle or other kinds of almost niche topics like matrices and stuff. So just a wider scope of math you can see on the ACT. And again, I mentioned, right, the amount of time per question is really important. So if we look at this is seconds per question. So if you look at the reading, for example, in the center here, the ACT, you get about 52 seconds per question. In the reading, SAT, you get 75 seconds per question. That's a 43% difference. So the SAT, again, even though the reading questions may be more difficult, you are getting a lot more time to do them. So a lot of the test isn't even about the content. It's about the structure of the test and the presentation and how your student can feel more comfortable with one or the other. So again, right, SAT has more forgiving timing structure, which is really good for some students. But those more complicated questions can also make it a more complicated test. Let's talk about math, for example. So this is kind of a breakdown of the percentage that these topics make up in the question layout. So on the SAT on the right, you'll see that about 62% of the questions are going to be algebra. That's a combination of algebra 1 and algebra 2. That's a really, really, heavy majority there. And then about 6% of geometry, that's like 3 or 4 questions, solid 30% in just basic arithmetic or data analysis, looking at stats, 2% in trig, that's 1 question, maybe 2. The ACT, on the other hand, you see again how it's a little bit more evenly spread out, right? Algebra is still a large chunk, it's still 46%, but geometry is a lot larger as well, 23%. And so the ACT, it's much more evenly distributed. But you have to go and review geometry, right? A lot of students, the last time they took that was maybe freshman year or so. So, maybe they need to go review that for the ACT, something to consider. The reading section, right? Oh, let me see my titles here. Sorry about that, y'all. So again, right, this kind of shows us the differences in the path you take through the reading section. The SAT here, you see the difficulty can really range as you go throughout the section. You could have some, decent, okay passages, and then you could really have a spike in difficulty where you have a really complicated passage. Maybe it's an old historical passage from the 1800s. Maybe it's just a really complicated scientific experiment. We don't know. But again, that range is not really even as you go through it. You may have more difficult passages stuck in there. The ACT, on the other hand, the ACT, on the other hand, the difficulty is more even as you go through that, but it's a lot faster too, right? So the SAT, you're doing 52 questions in 65 minutes. That's over an hour for the reading section. The ACT, on the other hand, you're doing 40 questions in 35 minutes. That is extremely fast. So again, even though the passages aren't as complex, you're having to go at a much faster rate. The science section, right? I mentioned the one on the ACT is a little different than the rest. So the ACT science section is unlike anything on the SAT. The SAT has some science mixed into reading and writing, even math. They have some charts and things. But on the ACT science section, you are essentially presented with a scientific experiment, like something here on the right, and you are asked to interpret the results. You do not have to understand the science. So if we look at this one right here, it's talking about a bacteria absorbing different frequencies of light. You are not expected to know anything about that. The biggest thing is, can you look at this chart and make some inferences, right? You see where the spikes are, how could you explain that? Things like that. So again, testing your scientific skills, not your science knowledge. That's often where it gets a little confusing for some students. They may feel frustrated saying, like, I did really bad in the science section, but I'm really good in chemistry. What went wrong there? Nothing went wrong. You're still really great at chemistry. This is just a very weird section on the test. So again, that's kind of like the details about how all of those sections compare. Really, the best thing to do for you and your student is to kind of pick one test, is to take a practice test of both. Take an SAT and take an ACT, and then compare them, right? Did you get a lot higher score on one over the other? Did your student hate one less than the other one? And then focus on that test from there. So again, there's a lot more detail you can get into on the type of questions, but often the best thing to do is to just take one and see how you feel about it. So after you've kind of decided on that, what's next here, right? So talking about, okay, now I decided I'm an ACT person, I'm an SAT person, what do I need to do now? First thing is to register for the tests. What's nice is that the SAT is through the College Board website. So that is the company that also does the PSAT as well as all of the AP exams. So you're probably familiar with them. You probably already have a login for them. So you would just go on their website and register. The ACT has its own website, just act.org. So again, nothing too crazy. You just register on their respective websites. If you are a student who has accommodations, you do need to think about that for these tests. So accommodations would be if you have, I believe it's an IEP or some sort of setup with your school where you get extra time for tests, you get this or that, whatever it is. You want to make sure you get these on these tests as well, right? Because it's going to allow you to do your best. So if you plan to take the SAT, you only have to do the application once, which is nice, because that's going to apply for anything the College Board offers. If you want to take the ACT, you do have to reapply for every time you take it. So if you take the ACT in June and July, you do have to send in 2 applications. So just something to think about as you're planning out your timelines. And you would do all of these applications I just mentioned through your school's guidance counselor or disabilities coordinator, or whoever you work with to get your other accommodations you get in the classroom. So colleges cannot see when a student has taken a test with accommodations. That's against the law. So do not worry, do not think this will put you at a disadvantage. It absolutely will not, right? If you have something like that available to you, you absolutely want to use it, right? So you can do your best. Another reason why you may want to take more than one test, right? I just mentioned taking multiple tests, and sorry about that. Seems like my little circles are off here today, but I'll kind of draw them in there for you. So it's super scoring. So the idea behind super scoring is that both tests will kind of craft your scores into a best of score. So for example, let's say you take the test in March. You get a 630 verbal and a 670 math. That's a really great math score. So then let's say you take it again in May and both your scores go down. That's a little frustrating. You weren't feeling well that day, or you had some AP exams that week. You were just tired. You just were not doing your best. Fully fine. So you take it again in June. And in June, you had really been working on bumping up your verbal score because you felt like it should be stronger. So you studied a lot and you really bumped it up. But your math wasn't quite there. You forgot to review some stats, and there were tons of stats questions on the tests. And it just, oh man, you almost got there though. What's nice is schools will do a super score. That means taking your best ever verbal score, which is from this June date, and your best ever math score, which is from this March date. They're going to combine those and make them into this super score right here at 1330. So there's value in taking the test more than once, and this is one of the biggest reasons to do so. You can focus on one section over the other. Again, if you just forgot to review something one day or something, maybe one of the reading passages which was really confusing to you or something, right? That helps you kind of work through that and get your best of score. The vast majority of schools are going to super score the SAT, and most are going to do the ACT as well, just a few that do one and not the other. Again, very few. I'm talking like 10, 15 schools maybe. The best thing to do is just to figure out whatever name of the school you're thinking about, do a quick little Google search, University of Georgia, do they super score ACT, whatever that is, right? And just, keep that down, whether that's through like a shared Google Doc or a notebook your family keeps or something, kind of just keep that information on hand, just to, think about that as you take these tests. All right. And so now that you kind of thought about, okay, I need to take tests more than once. This is the test I want to think about. I know how to register. How do I get ready for them, right? The best thing to do is to go ahead and start by finding those numbers for the schools you're thinking about, right? So you can use the College Board website, or you can use the Appleruth website. Those are both really good tools. And what you can do is that allows you to make a profile. You can add a bunch of different schools, and it's going to show you all the different scores those schools need, how you compare. They're both really great websites to do that with. Again, you can also just do it with a Google Doc or a notebook with your family. Just having it in one place is really important. And so now you need to think, okay, what are the numbers, right? I want to apply to this school. What are the test scores I need? So the biggest thing you want to do is you want to look up a phrase called freshman profile. Freshman profile for whatever school you're thinking about. Let's say it's Clemson. Let's say it's Clemson. Freshman profile for Clemson University. So you look that up, and what that's going to do is that, schools really like to brag on their most recently admitted class. And so often most schools, most big schools especially, are going to make a special page on their website where they give you a bunch of stats of their most recently admitted class. Again, most schools are going to do this. Some may not. They may have it on a different page or call it something different. You may have to hunt around a little bit, but usually they'll show some of these stats. And it's going to be stuff like, we have students from this many different countries. They did this many different activities, all kinds of random things. But usually near the top, you should see the stats for their test scores. Often they're probably just going to show you this middle 50th percentile number, but just in case they don't, that is the one you're looking for. So by middle 50th percentile, that's the middle 50% of students that were accepted, right? So the reason why we want to focus on that number is because that's where you start to be a competitive admission, right? We don't want to think about the bottom 25% of students, because those students are likely athletes, or they gave a bunch of money to the school, or had some sort of other thing going on. That's not going to apply to most. So we don't want to focus on that number. We don't want to look and see, okay, this student had the lowest test score of the whole group. I just need to get more than them. No, that's not how it works, right? We want to look for that middle 50th percent. Of course, the top 25%, also great to be in there, right? But we don't necessarily need to be in that set to be competitive. So again, you're looking for the middle 50th percentile in the freshman profile, whatever school it is. Often they may only show that number. You can safely assume it's the middle 50% if you see it. So again, right, the biggest thing is, as you're starting this journey, is to do research, right? Get these numbers together, start making these lists. Then, once you see this is what I need to get into these schools, what am I starting with, right? Take a practice SAT or ACT, or an official one, whatever you feel better with doing, and look at that number and see, okay, am I in line yet? If you're not, then it's time to do some work, right? Time to do some studying and try to bump up that score. So multiple test dates, right? We already talked about that once with the super scoring. Other reasons, right? You gain confidence over time. So going in and taking that test for the first time is often a little nerve-wracking. Right? It may be at a school you're not familiar with. It's a little stressful. It's 8 a.m. on a Saturday. You don't want to be there. Kind of having already done it once makes you a little more confident, a little more comfortable. It also negates any test difficulty or scoring fluctuation. We mentioned earlier, right? Maybe you forgot to review geometry and it was on the test or something. You never know. Maybe you woke up with a cold. You just never know. Planning ahead for multiple test dates allows something like that not to be an end all be all thing. Just saying like, oh man, that stinks, but it's okay. I'll take it again in this month. It also allows you to set incremental goals, right? Let's say for your dream school, you do have to bump up your ACT score by about 4 points. Well, you're not stressed about doing that all in one go, right? You're saying, okay, let me start by trying to really bump up my reading score. I'm going to really study with reading. Then the next time I'm going to focus on math. Our recommendation is really just to plan for 3 tests and stop once you reach your goal. So again, pick 3 ACTs or 3 SATs. And then, if you do it early, you do it early. You don't need to take that third one or even that second one. And what's good about this is you have lots of opportunities to take either test. This is one of my favorite slides. So if you take a screenshot of any of them, this is a great one. So this really shows you how you can really craft a plan around the dates the tests are offered. And again, also by thinking about this ahead of time and making a plan, you're saving yourself a lot of stress. So you want to think about stuff like, does my child do a spring sport, a fall sport? Do they go away to summer camp every summer? Are they in the fall musical? All kinds of things, right? So let's say your student has a spring sports, they're available in the fall. And let's say they want to take the SAT. Well, if we look right here, these 3 SATs are perfect, right? October, November, December, done. 3 shots right in a row, you get it over with, right? That's really great. Let's say they do a fall sport and they want to take the ACT instead. These are just ideas. April, June, July is a great set of ACT dates, right? So, just again, by planning this out a year ahead of time, you're not stressed, you're not trying to cram a bunch of tests the last minute, while your student's already busy with other things. And so again, it's just going to relieve a lot of stress off of everyone in general. The idea behind this too, right, is if you're starting with this April ACT, you want to start studying a couple months before. You want to start maybe thinking about doing some prep in February. Same for here, right? Maybe you want to think about doing prep back in August, maybe. And again, saving yourself a lot of stress by doing it incrementally, slowly, not trying to cram it all in. And you have to take practice tests, right? I kept mentioning it. So the biggest thing here is the practice test tells you a lot about the real thing, right? By practice test, most really are like retired SATs or retired ACTs. They are real valuable tests. So it's going to give you a starting point, a baseline. Again, so you can say, I'm right here and the school I want to be in is this. I need to improve, right? It tells you how big of an improvement that is going to be for you. So it's going to tell you about time management, mental fatigue. Are you running out of time? Are you missing questions towards the end? Wrong answer patterns, right? Maybe you are missing all the questions about circles. You need to go back and review circles, right? So by taking a practice test, it's allowing you to really target and focus all of your studying, all of your test prep. So instead of just doing a bunch of reading passages, when reading's your best section, you're doing a bunch of writing passages instead and reviewing the rules for commas and such. So again, we're talking about being efficient, planning ahead of time, lowering that stress. This is a great first step to take to make sure that the time you're putting in is worthwhile. So we talked about all that, right? How is that changing after the pandemic? And it is changing a little bit, right? So the new world order is largely test optional. Right, so that means that test optional means a school will consider your application complete if you send test scores and if you don't send test scores. It's up to you if you want to send it or not. If you send it, they'll look at it. If you don't, they won't think about it. Doesn't mean a strong test score isn't going to strengthen your application. Doesn't mean it's not still helpful in other ways as well. Things that have also been optional the whole time are taking hard classes, submitting good AP scores, demonstrating interest, rising to leadership positions in your clubs, volunteering, all that good stuff, right? It's always been optional. They're not required for admission, but they definitely make a difference in your application, right? So, a good test score can kind of act the same way as, trying to become president of one of your clubs. Again, what does it mean? It will consider an application complete even if you haven't sent in those scores. So if you did send in with scores, the college will review those as part of it, and they'll consider students with and without equally. So just kind of a different way to do it. So something to think about, again, there have been a historic number of college applications post-pandemic, right? The fact that some schools aren't requiring test scores has made it a lot more, not available, but approachable, right? A lot more possible for students to apply. Students who maybe beforehand didn't have time to test, didn't feel strong in their test scores, didn't remember to test or send in the scores, right? There's so many, didn't have the resources. So people have just been sending more applications. But, right, that also means there's more applications to look at, right? We see some really big schools like NYU, UCLA, Duke going up by 20, 30%. And then Colgate, which is a really small school. Can you imagine the 2 or 3 person admissions office at Colgate being overwhelmed with admissions, right? Applications. So that's a big changing thing. Selective schools became even more selective, right? If you think about more applications, they still only have so many spaces for students each year. So, a big place like NYU, like we mentioned, used to accept 16% of students, and now it's only 12%. Some of these numbers seem like a small difference, but if you go down to Duke, it used to be 11, now it's 4.6. Those are like Ivy League numbers. And down here is the biggest one to note, Auburn, Alabama, right? Used to accept 81% of kids. That's kind of like a shoo-in, right? That's your easy school. Now they only take 49%. Auburn used to be an easy school to get into, and now it's half and half, right? Just the number of applications you're getting is just making this more selective. And we talked about Ivy, right? Ivy admit rates plummeted too, right? If applying for Harvard, just for fun is become a lot easier because you don't have to send test scores, more kids are going to send in applications. That's more applications for them to wade through. And so, it's become even harder to get into those Ivy League schools as well. A strong test score is just going to look good, and it can help differentiate you. With more applicants, fewer test scores, and less certainty, a lot of admissions offices have turned to early decision. So early decision is when you apply to a school and you say, I'm only applying to this school, and if you accept me, I will absolutely enroll. Different from early applications and stuff like that, a little different. Early decision is kind of the really determined one. If you think about it, a school that has so many applications, it's much easier for them to say, oh, look at this group of kids who say they will absolutely come if we let them in. I'm much more tempted to say yes to more of those kids because that is logistically easier for us. That guarantees us a more full class. I can pick kids who I know are well-rounded. It looks better to them, right? So if you look at this, again, we're talking about some big schools like Duke. 54% of their freshman class are kids who did early decision. And that's like the number of seats are gone to everyone else. So again, it's just become so much more certain in some ways and so much more restricted in other ways. So really, again, the test scores still can make an impact on your application if you're wanting to make it stand out. So, right, they're a hedge against grade inflation. So many students all over the country have all A's now. And, you can't make a point that the A's mean the same between different school districts and different states, right? They aren't going to be equal. They're not going to be objective. Test scores are always and have been a strong predictor of graduation, right? If we accept students with this test score, they will likely graduate within 4 years. That's a really good thing for the school. They want to brag about those rates. They're a helpful way to compare a broad, diverse group of applicants, right? So if you think about, you have students applying from more rural areas that only offered 1 or 2 AP classes, and students applying from urban areas who pretty much were in all AP classes, right? It would of course be unfair to compare them on those kinds of advantages. But if they are both good at test scores in some ways are objective. They can also help differentiate students who look similar, right? So 2 students, all A's, all AP classes, geniuses, lots of club work, all this good stuff. One has got an almost perfect score and one has a pretty decent score. But at the end of the day, that almost perfect score can make that other student look better. So again, it's just another thing to strengthen your application if that's available for you, right? And it's still required by some schools, right? Not all schools are test optional. So for example, a lot of public colleges in the South have kept that. Florida State, Florida, FAMU, Tennessee, Georgia, Georgia Tech, all still require them. And some of these schools also, I'm sorry, some of these states, especially I personally know about the ones in the South. So like Louisiana and Florida and South Carolina and Georgia, a lot of them have state-run scholarship programs. And some of those state-run scholarship programs, part of getting that scholarship is you have to have a minimum GPA and you have to submit a test score. For example, again, I'm from Georgia, as you can tell. I only know about that one, but to get the Zell Miller Scholarship, which pays for 100% of your tuition, you have to submit a test score that's above, a certain number. So that is something to think about. You want to do that research and think about it. There are some colleges who also offer you scholarships based on your test score. University of Alabama, for example. If you go to University of Alabama, I think if you give them a 26 ACT score, they automatically give you like $10,000, right? You just don't want to leave money on the table like that. So it's really all about researching the schools you're thinking about and seeing, is a strong test score going to get me some money? Is it going to help me get in? Is it worth pursuing, right? Is it something I want to think about doing, even though it's optional? Some schools, really small amount of schools, don't use test scores at all. That's called being test blind, and that's totally different. So if you see a school that does that, totally different. That means they will not accept scores. They don't want to consider scores in any way. Again, very small number of schools, kind of some more smaller exclusive liberal arts schools tend to do this. I know University of Chicago is one. I can't think of any others, but they tend to be small private schools that do this. But again, just remember this as you're doing your research on colleges. Oh, we talked about merit a second ago, right? Not submitting those test scores can affect that. Like I mentioned, a lot of those state-run scholarship programs, this is part of it, as well as other schools too. Oh, here it is. Sorry, you guys, I was getting ahead of myself. So sample for University of Alabama, right? So, right, if you send in a 27 ACT, you automatically get $8,000, right? Gosh, that's so worth it, right? And if you even think about it, right? Let's say you had a 29. Let's say you have a 29 on your ACT. Man, if you do a little bit of studying and bump that up by one, you're going to get $9,000 more dollars. That's worth it, right? So again, just think about this. Look into the schools that you're considering and look at the value in these kinds of things. So should I send in the test scores then? The question again, does it add value to your application? Is it something you want the admissions office to see? And they may matter more in certain sections, right? So for example, this is just a quote, admission rates were similar between those with and without test scores, except in STEM and business sometimes. Students with test scores got in at much higher rates because, maybe you didn't have the opportunity to take AP math at your school or AP science, but you want to go into STEM. A really strong math or science score on one of these tests can help, add to that and say, I am still strong at these, even though I didn't have that opportunity, which is not my fault. Matter by major too, right? So, fine arts students, it's totally fine, right? If you have a not as high of a test score as you would like, right? That's probably not what they're looking at the end of the day. They're not going to be so concerned with one maybe being higher than the other or something. So again, it just matters on what you're trying to study, if there's specific programs you're applying for. And it depends on your GPA too, right? The idea is you want to tell a story. So if you have average scores, but amazing academic credentials, maybe you're just not a great test taker and you get really anxious, and that's totally normal. But if you think about it, saying, sending in those not as great average scores compared to your amazing other credentials doesn't tell a story that makes a lot of sense. So it could be worth leaving them off, right? Test scores well below their grades, again, doesn't match. It's not really great to think about. On the other hand, right, maybe students who don't have as wonderful of GPAs have a higher test score that could help you, right? Or it could tell a story. Think about, for example, maybe you had a lot of trouble or something personal going on your freshman year and your grades really suffered, but you worked hard, you improved your grades over time. And having good test scores at the end of that kind of just helps, right? Helps tell a complete story about your growth as a student, your growth academically. And that's also something you can include in your essay portion too, to kind of explain that and talk about, what you learned over those years and how, you studied really hard for this test. And those test scores are really just kind of like an exclamation point on all of your improvements you've had. Again, individual section scores matter, right? So this is really interesting. Not all 1400s are created equal, right? Let's say you're applying to a selective engineering program. You have a 600 verbal, 800 math. That's a perfect score in math. Wow, even though it's a 1400, which is a good score, but not a tippy top score, 800 math, that's so crazy impressive. Oh my gosh. That's different, right? If you have a 600 in math and 800 in verbal, and you're still applying to the engineering program, a little more concerning, right? You would, if I want a student who's really already, shining in that realm, I would rather see a more impressive math score from them. So again, it's complicated. And, it could be worth, okay, well, can I bump up my math score? Can I do a little bit more studying? Or, if that's the highest I can get it, maybe I don't include it for this particular school because this is the program I want to look at, and it's just not going to help me shine in that way. There we go. Remember, you can't unsee a weak score, right? So maybe it takes more time, right, to consider, do I send this or do I not, right? And by you cannot unsee a weak score, I mean by like a total score. So for example, if you're submitting a super score, the school is still only going to look at your highest of. So you don't, have to worry about that. They expect, probably expect people to do a little bit of studying and to improve. So don't stress about that. But it may mean that you want to wait till you finish taking the test to see the highest score you've gotten so far before you send them off. Just a little bit more time thinking about it, essentially. Okay, we're almost there, I promise. I'm ready to take your questions soon, but let's talk briefly about the SAT. There have been some specific changes to that test. So they no longer offer the subject test or the essay that was gotten rid of in 2021. And they are going to start doing digital testing in the next couple of years. So I just want to clarify. So March 2023 is for international digital testing. So if you're an international student, you can think about that. March 2024 is when they're going to start doing US digital testing. So what this is interestingly doing, right? If you are someone who's in the class of 2025, you're kind of on the cusp of both of these, right? So class of 2025, I believe, are sophomores now. Yes. So what you could do is, pre-March 2024, so that would be spring of your junior year. Yes. You could try to take the SAT before that, right? Do the paper test, get a good score, focus on that. And then what's interesting is you could also take the digital test too, right? And see how that is. So that's just an interesting mix for, some students who are in the class of 2025 in particular. I've kind of just found, again, you're in a weird spot where you kind of could take both and see which one you like better. Or if you want to deal with digital, you can do it early, do the paper. Just an interesting spot. Even the class of 2026, if you're ahead in math and stuff, you could still try to do the paper if you'd like. The digital test is interesting and has its own benefits though. So don't, write it off. I still think it's worth trying if you are in that realm of kind of being able to do both. There's a lot more details about how that works. Alpruth does offer some more detailed webinars on the digital SAT. We'll say it's kind of complex how it works, but just interesting the changes they're going to have. Some of you guys may also have the October 2023 PSAT, maybe digital for some schools. I have heard of that. So you guys may see that starting to be an option too. Kind of nice to get a nice practice run with the digital format as well. So again, lots of changes there. I definitely recommend looking it up, and some other things. Again, Alpruth offers lots of webinars talking a little bit more about the SAT changes, but that's something that's just coming. So just keep an eye on. But thankfully we're ready, right? So we have been on the cutting edge for over 20 years. We currently offer fixed form digital SATs and ACTs, even though the ACT hasn't even announced it. And we are definitely on top of the news. As we learn more about it, we release updated prep materials and digital testing. We have a really informative newsletter I recommend signing up for that keeps you up to date on all that news. So before we go to Q&A, we are going to pop a little poll in your chat box there. I believe it should pop up. Just asking you a little bit more about yourself and how we did tonight. So if you don't mind filling that out, that would be great. Helps us improve. Also, I do want to mention, if you are interested in some of our services, Alpruth is having a sale this month, in the month of December. And so the more tutoring hours you purchase, the more you get for free. So I believe it's like buy 10, get 2 free, buy 20, get 4 free, so on and so forth. I believe we also have sales on other kinds of tutoring as well. So if you're thinking about getting a student ready for that, this is a great time to do that. The hours never expire. So if you want to, get those on a deal and then save them for later or split them between a couple kids, you're definitely welcome to do that. I just want to make sure I mention that. All right, and now I'm happy to take your questions. Yeah, so submit those questions through the Q&A function. Okay, December deal, I think that's the code you use. Um, yeah, okay, good. So yeah, so submit your questions through the Q&A function. I want to try to answer as many as I can. If you want me to go back to a slide or re-explain something, I'm also happy to do that as well. No questions so far? Okay, well, I'll go ahead and maybe kind of chat about some common questions I get. Maybe it'll kind of make you guys think of some more. So a lot of people often ask, when should I start testing, right? Um, and the best thing to think about is, when is your student taking Algebra 2? The reason why I say that is because Algebra 2 makes up a lot of the content on both tests in the math section. So, if you're a student who takes Algebra 2 as a sophomore, you can test a little bit earlier, right? You can kind of get it over with maybe the summer before junior year or so. If you're taking Algebra 2 as a junior, you maybe want to test, later in junior year, maybe in the spring or so. Something just to consider, right? This comes into play. So it's a really big thing to consider as far as the timing goes. Oh, I do have a question. Good. All right. Are there mock ACTs offered in January? Yeah, absolutely. Appareil should be offering mock tests pretty much year round. We're pretty good about that, except for like a couple weeks during the holidays, of course. But yeah, so you should be able to see those on our website, appruth.com. We offer online mock tests. We also offer some in-person ones depending on where you are in the country. We have markets in Atlanta and DC and New York and Seattle. I believe that's all of them right now. Okay, so someone wants to go back to the Ivy admit rate slide. Absolutely. I believe the stars are from like estimated numbers. Okay. The reason why there's asterisks on Penn and Princeton for the Ivy admit rate slide is that they are withholding their most recent acceptance rates. So that's from like 2022. These are estimates from the 2021 data. It just means we're a year behind on the data in these. That's all. But guesses, and that's why there's a range as well there. I think they made estimates based on that. It's a question though. Okay. Why has Auburn become so popular? I don't know. I want to be biased and say it's because I went to Georgia. I'm not sure, but I'm really not sure. So I think another reason, thinking about why some schools have gotten so many more applications. There's a lot of reasons. First of all, ease, right? If you're a student and you're applying to schools, it's an extra step to go to the ACT website and tell them to send your scores to this school and that. So, and it costs money, right? It costs $15 or so, I think, every time you send scores out. So students who are financially constrained in some way, maybe they have to limit the number of schools they're applying to, right? Or students who can get to take the test, or again, who are just applying en masse to a bunch of places, it becomes easier to apply. In a school like Auburn, I think in a state like Alabama, Auburn and Alabama are two really, really huge schools. I'm sure they already get a really large number of applications. So my biggest guess, it's just become easier to apply. So you probably just get a lot more applications in general there. So it's a good question though, I'm not sure. Auburn does have a really good, I believe it's like engineering program, or like it deals with airplanes though. So that's always great. Anyway, sorry, I digress. Are schools more inclined to take the SAT versus the ACT? Absolutely not. Those are equally accepted across the board. So really it's about which one your student's going to be better at or feels better about. Is there advantage taking an online mock ACT through Appruth versus independently on your own? So I would say the benefit in the Appruth one, I'm going to go back a couple slides. And of course, you can do all kinds of options, whatever is better for you and your student. But go try to find this here. Yeah, so this page, these screenshots are from the Appruth report that you get. So Alperuth has some software that really interprets your scores and tells you more about, how you did, right? So you kind of see these things. You lost the most points on this type of question, things like that. So, there's some value, I think, in those kinds of numbers you get as a result. Alperuth can also help you interpret them. But of course, if you have another one that's available, you definitely can. I don't know how many online ones the ACT has. I think they may only have one. So the advantage is also that's more tests, right? But ultimately, it really is up to you guys, whatever you prefer. Of course, I would recommend Alperuth just because the interpretation you get from the practice test is really valuable, because this is really a lot of what we focus on. Okay, based on my experience, what's a realistic range of improvement in scores that students might see with prep? Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give you a couple numbers, and remember, these are all little, there's room for margin, just margins there, right? So some of these numbers I actually just got today, we were talking about them. So this is, we offer, one-on-one tutoring with a tutor, a live tutor. We offer group classes. We also offer like a self-paced online program. That self-paced program is like watching interactive lessons, doing practice questions, things like that. So these numbers are from 50 hours of a combined instruction and work with the online program. You can expect about 4, and this is not a promise, right? This is just an idea, 4 ACT points, if I could spell correctly, or 120 SAT points. Those are pretty, goodness gracious, sorry, y'all. Those are pretty normal numbers that we see. But again, it depends on every student's different, right? If you are a student who is already at the tippy top, right, you are a student who's scoring 33s on the ACT. Well, first of all, you simply can't go up more than 3 points. Also, it's harder as you go up higher, right? Go from a 33 to a 34 is so hard because as you get towards the top, every question matters. It gets a lot harder to get more points. On the other hand, maybe you took the test the first time, you were stressed about it, you've kind of gained some confidence, you reviewed the geometry, which you haven't seen in years, you just feel better overall. You could see a larger score than that, a score increase than that, just because of where you started, right? So these are kind of numbers you're thinking about as you go through. You can also think about stuff like, have I even finished Algebra 2 yet? If I'm only halfway through it, then I simply just have more math I need to learn. That's a good question. Can a student who's a bad test taker, maybe they had scored poorly on the PSAT and PACT, but a good academic student, have a significant increase? It's kind of a similar question, right? I think so. Again, all students are different. Students who have really bad test taking anxiety, which is totally normal, may have different results and different impacts on different things. But I definitely think tutoring is something that's valuable, especially when you are thinking about helping to increase the confidence. Really having someone in your corner who's not only reviewing the math itself, but how to approach the math, I think is helpful. It can make a student more confident over time. But again, right, maybe you are a student who has really, really excellent academics and you just are a bad test taker, and that's okay. It happens, right? Maybe test optional is a good way for you to go in the long term. Something to think about, right? And that's kind of what's nice about this whole test optional movement. It gives you those options, which is nice, right? Options. Should our sophomore plan to do one PSAT at the end of this summer? Okay, so briefly to talk about the PSATs in question. So the PSAT is like its own little monster. I believe we have some webinars about that too. So PSAT is only offered once each year through your school. And that's because it is a whole different, more controlled thing. I can move this here. Once each year through your school. It's typically October. Some schools do at different times, but either way, your school will only offer it once a year. So PSAT is only a whole other thing. Colleges never see this. It is for essentially it's a practice, and it's for a scholarship program, which is a whole other different thing. So just keep that in mind. It's totally different, but the scores are still valuable, are still great practice, right? And a good starting point. So if your student did really well on it, then okay, that's a good starting point. It's kind of where you're at right now. The scores are pretty comparable to what you would get on an SAT. So The question was, should we do another PSAT at the end of the summer? You probably aren't able to do a PSAT at the end of the summer. And then do 3 SATs in fall of next year. So a couple of things. I would say that I would not have a student take more than 3 or 4 tests max, just because at Appleworth, we've kind of found that after 4 tests, after 3 tests really, especially after 4 though, students really just don't see any more increases. They've kind of just, tested out, kind of just burnt out with it. He says he's already taken a sophomore who's already taken Algebra 2. Sophomore this year, he's already done Algebra 2. So if you're a sophomore this year, you've already done Algebra 2. Let's go back and look at the calendar so I can think about this a little better. Of course, you want to think about it as your student doing a fall sport or, anything like that. That's always part of it as well. But if you feel like SATs are good for them, you definitely could do a set of 3 SATs there, right? They are going to be offered the PSAT in October anyway. All juniors, like most of the time, take the PSAT. Very similar to the SAT, sorry. That's totally an option. If you want to do it in the spring, you have March and May options. You've got lots of options. But if you have a sophomore who's in Algebra 2 now, they'll finish it by junior year. They don't have any fall activities in junior year. That's a great setup to do it. Yeah, nice to get out of the way. Sophomore in Algebra 2 currently. Okay, yeah, I got it. Okay, yeah, so your sophomores in Algebra 2 currently. Yeah, fall of your junior year is a great time to test. Again, if you're not doing any fall sports or fall activities or anything, you don't want to stress yourself out too much. Someone said, what's a good PSAT score for a sophomore? You're not gonna like my answer because my answer is that it depends. A good score is something that tells you more about yourself and what you can do. That's an annoying answer, I'm sorry. But if you want to look, you can look on your PSAT score report. You get that by logging into the College Board website, collegeboard, I think it's .org. If I would spell it correctly, sorry. And you can look up the percentiles. So they should say percentiles underneath your score that you have. And that could tell you how they compare to other sophomores. So for example, if they're in the 75th percentile, that means they did better than 75% of students, of other sophomores. So, that can help you figure out where they are in relation to other students. Apart from that, though, again, a good score is something that teaches you and tells you where you are, and tells you, what you need to do next. And again, you're a sophomore, right? Think about what math class are you in? Have you ever taken one before? There's all kinds of factors there that you don't need to stress about. And remember, no one sees the PSAT score. No colleges see it. So you don't need to worry about that. Oh yeah, okay, so our PSAT score is similar to the SAT score. Sorry, yes, absolutely. So PSAT scores are pretty much a 1-to-1 to the SAT. So, you can say on average, right, a 1150 on a PSAT is about an 1150 on the SAT. Very, very common, very similar scores. You can expect that's about what you would have gotten. So the PSAT, the max you can get is a 1520. The SAT, the max you can get is a 1600. And that's because the PSAT is a little shorter. So their idea behind it is that they've taken off some of the content. They've taken off like 80 points worth of content. That's the idea behind it. So because of that, higher scores are different, right? So for example, a 1520 on the PSAT is perfect, a perfect score. That's going to be much more similar to like a 1590 or 1600 even on the SAT. So essentially all of that, what I'm trying to say is for the most part, yes, they are really similar. The only difference is as you get into the higher range, might be a little bit off. But from pretty much everyone else, very similar comparison scores. And sorry to get into the weeds and the details. I just want to make sure I cover all the bases depending on what you guys are all asking about. And Alpharuth does offer, I believe, some PSAT webinars, all kinds of stuff you can look up. We have a lot of great resources and articles on our blog too that kind of tells you a little bit more about some of these things. Okay, so are there any more questions, you guys? We're getting near the end of our time here. And if you guys don't have any questions, y'all are welcome to go. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I'll hang around a little bit more, see if anyone has any more questions though. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to let y'all go for this evening. Again, my name is Heather Meadows Adamson with Appleruth. It's been really nice having you guys. I love answering these questions. Oh, one more popped in. Where can we retrieve the recording? That's a good question. I believe it'll be sent to you. Let me ask yes, okay. My partner behind the scenes here is giving us a little bit of help on this one. I believe it will be sent to you though. All right, perfect. A recording will be sent to the email used to register for this event later on this week. Perfect, you got it. Yeah, all right. So there's no other questions. I'm gonna let you guys go for the evening. Again, thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your evening.